The 9-part lecture series provides the Missoula community with a space to discover and exchange information about topics that are pertinent to women and people of diverse ethnic backgrounds. We're excited that this is the first presentation for the 13-14 seasons. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Anisa Goforth. Dr. Goforth is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Montana. Her research is related to multicultural issues in school psychology, social emotional interventions for children, and adaptation of evidence-based interventions for ethnic minority children. After the presentation, I'll be handing out some evaluations, so please stick around. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone coming in the middle of the day on a Friday, especially on a gorgeous day when it's really nice to be outside. Is it okay if I sit? I want this to be a really relaxed presentation because this is going to be much more discussion-based, and as I talk, please stop me, ask questions, and I'll have some kind of prompts to have us thinking about this. But I really thank you to the YWCA for inviting me. I think the premise of social justice and supporting the reduction of racism is certainly a part of my research philosophy, and certainly a part of what I do, and I train my graduate students in school psychology to really be social justice advocates in the schools, in school districts. Especially, I actually promote white school psychologists the most to be the strongest advocates because they have the privilege to do so. And so a lot of what I do is integrating multicultural issues, social justice issues into my research. So today, I'm actually sharing a little bit of my dissertation when I was a graduate student. And I thought it'd be an interesting topic given kind of the social political climate right now and talking about Arab Americans, Muslim Americans. And this is something I'm really passionate about. I work with a lot of different ethnic minority children, but this one was a specific interest of mine for my dissertation. So the title, Am I American or Arab, or both, right? Which I think is a question a lot of ethnic minority children have. And I'm going to address a little bit about acculturation, religiosity, and acculturative stress as a context to this. So I'm going to do some introductions to myself, and I kind of want to see who you are and what your interests are. That'll provide some context to the discussion, hopefully, for the group. And then talking about what acculturation is, and then our research study, and then I'm hoping for some time for Q&A, but I think it'll be integrated throughout. So I kind of want to know who you are because it gives me some context as to maybe why you're interested in coming to this presentation. I know some of you work for the YWCA. How many of you actually work here? Awesome, thank you. And then for those of you who aren't, are you community members? Are you educators? Community members? Okay. Any of you educators or work with children in any capacity? Okay, good. Yeah, in some capacity.
I like to do grandparent volunteering in the schools.
Excellent. Okay, good. Well, that helps me kind of understand a little bit about some of the maybe questions that we might have today. So who am I? Why am I a white woman talking about ethnic minority background? This is kind of the context. I've lived overseas my entire life. I didn't live in the United States. I'm Australian and American by citizenship. The places in red are the places I've lived. And the places are blue, the places I've traveled. And my background is I was born in Yemen, in Jubla, Yemen, a very small town. It's a tiny little village town where my parents, who's Australian American, met when they were teachers in the 80s. And so they met, and this is my mom and my dad, who are now currently in Prague, bicycling 600 kilometers through Europe. My mom's birthday was yesterday, she turned 60. And so their kind of promotion of multiculturalism really kind of infused who I am and why I really believe in social justice and supporting children from minority groups. They raised me overseas, and not until I got to Portland, Oregon did I live in the United States. And so my love and passion for it kind of continued. And what we know about Arab Americans in this context is I was born in Yemen, but I'm certainly not Arab. I'm not ethnically Arab. I'm not nationally Arab or Yemeni. Although I could be, if my dad was Muslim, I guess I could have been 3 passports. But essentially, how I identify myself and my skin color and my ethnicity and my culture, those are 3 different things, right? And so sometimes we can kind of interlock these issues of who am I, you know, as a person, who am I as a racial being, who am I as an ethnic minority, who am I as a cultural being. And for those of us who identify as part of Caucasian or white Americans, we often don't think about our own culture because we're in the mainstream culture and we may not think about it, right? And now, what's interesting is the social political climate has kind of escalated, and certainly since September 11th, 2001, it's been this promotion of perceptions of Arab Americans specifically, and Muslim Arab Americans in particular. So it got me thinking, you know, what do we know about this group? You know, is there anything particular about this group that we need to know more about? And as a psychologist, that's very interesting to me because identity development is important. But I thought I'd throw out the question to all of you is, what do you know about Arab Americans, and what are some common beliefs or assumptions about that group? And it could be stereotypes or prejudice, that's okay, but what's kind of talked about this particular group? Yeah.
That all Arab Americans are Muslim.
Okay, that's a great assumption, absolutely. What other beliefs or assumptions?
Well, one thing that I knew, but it was interesting to be hearing it lately, and that is that Persians are not Arabs. And
that is a common belief. So
Yeah.
Iranians, for example, are
Right.
not actually Arab.
Right.
Other perceptions or beliefs that you've heard in the media or heard from other people? Yeah.
I guess that all Muslims aren't radical Islamists.
Okay.
Willing to take that next step to like militancy.
Sure. And that's what's interesting about Arab Americans is that religiosity is a really core component of our perceptions as outsiders, perhaps, of that community. And then we actually don't realize there's actually more Christian Arab Americans in the United States than there are Muslim Arab Americans. So let me give you some context of Arab Americans. So nearly 3 million Arab Americans in the United States. However, the U.S. government does not officially recognize the Arab ethnic group. They are not part of the U.S. Census, and therefore they're underrepresented actually in the U.S. Census. So, and if you think about Arabs, there are black Arabs, there are white Arabs, there are Turkish Arabs, Syrian Arabs, there are Egyptian Arabs, right? So as an ethnic group, however, the U.S. government doesn't actually officially recognize them, and therefore this is an underestimation. This is actually based on an Arab American Institute demographics. And there's actually a population growth, which is interesting because Arab Americans have been part of the United States since the 1800s, but within the last 30 years, there's certainly a significant growth. And what you may not know is that actually in Montana, I looked at these statistics, there's actually 1,700 Arab Americans in our state, and which more than doubled since 1980. Most of them are Lebanese descent, so almost over half of the group. And then others identify just generally Arab or Egyptian, other Arab, Iraqi, or Jordanian. So there's quite a few in the state of Montana, and given that we're such a small population anyway, it's interesting to know. And in the county, biggest county, so we're kind of at the nearly 200, I guess, so in Missoula County. So there's certainly Arab Americans in Montana, but we maybe not even recognize it. When our previous department chair and our current psychology professor is actually Jordanian, and so he's one of the few Arab Americans that I know in the state, but he's been around since the 70s, so there's certainly a lot out there. But what's interesting about these statistics is that certainly there's an existing population here, but as you mentioned in assumptions and beliefs, there's really significant perceived discrimination, prejudice against this group in particular. I went to graduate school at Michigan State University for my PhD, which is near Detroit, which is the largest Arab American population, which is actually where I did my research study. And one thing I noticed about that area is that even though there's more exposure to Arab Americans on a regular basis, that was certainly in Detroit, there was a lot of discrimination, a lot of stereotypes against the group, and it really impacted that community. And when I was looking at some recent statistics, In the 2012, 78 bills were actually submitted into the US government, either Congress or the House, designed to vilify Islam specifically. So, which, if you were, think of yourself as an adolescent, a teenager who's Arab American, and you, perhaps Muslim, but maybe not, then you're thinking, gosh, you know, the government is saying something about my ethnic group. Not only are they not recognizing me as part of the US Census, but they're actually saying something about my religion, and who this they person, right? It's the man person. But it's certainly, as a teenager, you know, how does that affect you? Similarly, 51 anti-mosque acts were recorded, 29 in 2012 and 22 in 2011. So there's continuing kind of actual acts of violence against the group. And then more than a quarter of Americans are not okay of having a mosque in their area. So even though I'm focusing specifically on Arab Americans, we do associate Arab Americans with Islam, and there is a substantial number of Arab Americans who are Muslim. So this is certainly an important consideration. So there's all these negative portrayals. But then I was like, gosh, you know, I wonder how many celebrities are out there that are Arab American. And I actually kind of surprised by this. So I collected a bunch of Arab American celebrities, everyone from Jerry Seinfeld to Salma Hayek to, oh, what's her name? Kathy Najimy, she's in Sister Act, right? So there's quite a few celebrities that are Arab American. And you can think of yourself as a teenage girl and be like, you know, who do you look up to? I don't think any of these have essentially talked about their Arab Americanism, right? And as a adolescent, and you're looking for that celebrity, that person to connect with, a role model, and if you didn't even know, I certainly did not know that these celebrities were Arab American, how would that influence the development of their identity, of their self-esteem, who they are as an ethnic minority group? So I thought that was it was an interesting part of my presentation, because I was like, I had no idea Salma Hayek was Arab American, or Jerry Seinfeld. So to put this into context, I was a graduate student at the time, and I really was passionate about social justice. And so as I was thinking about these Arab teenagers, I was working in a clinic, and I was working with a lot of Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs. And I realized that we didn't know a lot about them in the psychological literature. When I started this dissertation, I think there was 4 articles on Arab Americans in general, any study ever done with Arab Americans, and that's in contrast to thousands, hundreds of thousands of Latin Americans, African Americans, and other ethnic groups. And which made it difficult because I didn't even know where to start. And some of them were from the 70s and 80s. So I was really passionate about it. This needs to be really explored. So in my research study, I looked at some issues talking about adolescent development. Okay, so think of yourself as a teenager. Your ethnic identity might be a really important component. Acculturation. So my parents are immigrating to the United States before I was born, but that has influenced my cultural development, my traditions, my values. But then I also feel American because I go to an American high school. I'm taught American history. My accent's American. I feel American. I listen to hip hop. So who am I? Who am I? More Arab? Am I American? And I thought about this tension that these kids were experiencing, and I wanted to learn more about it. And so what I was particularly interested in is this idea of acculturation. So I'll talk a little bit after this about what acculturation is and how I define it. I was also interested in acculturative stress, which is the psychological distress or stress you experience during the process of acculturation. And then I was interested, well, is there differences among adolescents? So comparing to an 11-year-old and a 21-year-old, you know, gosh, that's a huge part of our experience as a child, even though technically by law in the United States, 18 is our adulthood. We know psychologically it doesn't really continue, it kind of continues into 21. So I'm like, you know, are there differences there? And then I started asking, gosh, you know, what about female Arab Americans versus male Arab Americans? You know, we didn't talk about our assumptions and beliefs, but oftentimes gender equality is something that's a really a misperception often about Arab Americans and Arabs in general. So I'm like, is there different experience between girls and boys in their acculturative experiences? And does this impact ultimately their psychological adjustment or their mental health. And what I was hypothesizing was that, well, maybe if you identify yourself as more American, you would feel more connected with our culture, the mainstream culture. Maybe you'll feel you're part of in a larger mainstream community, and therefore maybe you're able to cope with your stresses a little bit better, and therefore you have better mental health. On the other hand, maybe being more Arab is actually a stronger connection with your community, especially for this population in Detroit, which has a large population of Arab Americans. Maybe they'll be more healthy because they have that ethnic minority. So it could have gone, I wasn't sure. There hadn't been really a lot done. With other ethnic minority groups, it has been shown that maintaining your heritage culture, such as your values, your traditions, your language, can be really healthy, mentally healthy. And so I thought, well, maybe that would be something that these adolescents would experience. And so I want to make sure I define acculturation for you, because that is sometimes assimilation, acculturation, these are kind of terms that have been thrown around. So I think of acculturation as bi-dimensional approach, which essentially means there's two sides. How I view myself as Arab, how I view myself as a mainstream American. And essentially, it's not about losing your heritage, which is, say, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, if there's an immigrant from another country, they're supposed to be Americanized, right? And that's called assimilation. Losing your heritage culture towards kind of this overall mainstream culture. So I defined it bi-dimensionally, meaning you can go with both. You can be very Arab and very American, not Arab, very American, very Arab, not American, or none, right? So there's kind of 4 ways you can approach it. So I was really interested in this idea. And I wanted to know, do you have to be both? Or do you have to be more American or more Arab to be more psychologically adjusted, have better mental health? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So what we also know is that it's associated with all sorts of psychological disorders. So depression and anxiety, marginalization, psychosomatic symptoms, like feeling like your head hurts or your tummy hurts when a kid is kind of distressed. We also know there's aggression and hyperactivity, so there's a lot of problems if a child experiences some negative acculturation in the sense of, I don't want to be either. I don't want to be Arab and I don't want to be American. So what I did, and this is part of the study, and I'm just briefly going over, I'm not going into the details of this. If you want to learn more, let me know. But essentially I asked adolescents who identified themselves as Arab American between the ages of 11 and 21 in essentially as a community center, and they completed a demographic questionnaire about acculturation, acculturated stress, religiosity, and psychological adjustment. And the part that I thought was also going to be interesting is, how do the parents deal with this? I know if they're born in the United States, do they feel more Arab? Do they feel more American? And I thought, let me just squeeze this in, let me ask the parents some questions too, which actually ended up being an important component of my research study. So they completed a demographics and acculturation questionnaire as well. If I'm going too fast, let me know. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So let me just jump to the results, essentially. So what I did find, interestingly, is that when an adolescent identifies themselves by their heritage culture, meaning their Arabness, but not their Americanness, they essentially, the higher religiosity, so the more religious they are, the more they identified with their heritage culture, which kind of makes sense, right? So we think about religion and how religion is often tied with our traditions and our values. It makes sense. The more religious they are, the more they identify with their heritage culture, which by itself may not be important, but in the context of this overall study was really interesting to me, because previously religion hadn't ever been looked at with Arab American adolescents. So what I think is going on a little bit here is that maybe religion provides a sense of security. So we often underestimate in schools, because we're not supposed to talk about religion in schools, but religion might be something really important for some kids. And so maybe it provides a sense of security, and I identify myself in a certain way because my religion helps me kind of connect with that community, that heritage community. Similarly, what was also interesting is that the more religious they were, the less perceived discrimination stress they experienced. So perceived discrimination stress was under this umbrella of acculturation stress. Stress they experienced through the process of acculturation. And what I found is that the more religious they were, the less likely they perceive that others are going to discriminate against them. Which is interesting. So if I'm Muslim, and these are all Muslim, if I identify with my religion, I don't identify another peer as going to be discriminating against me. And I'm not going to feel distress as a result of that. So it's not saying that they don't discriminate against them. It's that they don't perceive them discriminating against them. Which is an interesting idea, because to some degree, religion might be something protective. It's saying, you know, gosh, you're a minority in mainstream culture. They not only are you an ethnic minority, but you're specifically targeted with the media and social political issues. But yet your religion somehow protects you a little bit, and that maybe you don't perceive others discriminating against you as compared to others. So that was
because they aren't associating out there with the rest of the.
They are. They're in high
are.
schools. They're, yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh.
granted, this particular population that I looked at was in an ethnic minority enclave. That is, like, this was a community of lots of Arab Americans. If I took an Arab American in the state of Montana, in Wyoming, in Oregon, and not necessarily in this metropolitan area, it may look very different. Maybe that, I think it would. I think the ethnic minority community, like having the Arab community there, where there's Arab signs, there's advertisements with women in hijabs, that is something I think is protecting them, because it gives them a sense of connection with their community. I do think it would be different if I did it, say, in Montana, with our 17,700, Gita, you went there, but 1,771 Arab Americans in the state of Montana. So it's, you know, a small population, but, you know, it'd be interesting to see the difference there. Any other thoughts about these two? Any other kind of comments or, you know, surprises?
Maybe like being tied to that religion could just also like give them a better like feel of their identity, you know, and so maybe they're not like as affected by it because they're not like they're kind of like confident about like who they are and like where they came from, and it just it doesn't hit them as hard maybe than somebody who was kind of like lost and it was more personal for them, or maybe more sensitive subject for them.
Yeah, I think those are great ideas, and I liked your point about, well, there's something about self-esteem, right?
Yeah.
And if you think about religion, so maybe think of your own religion, or if you don't follow a religion, some of your traditions and values that you do have as part of your family, right? Where do those traditions and, you know, values come from? Often they come from religion. Sometimes they come from the heritage culture, but oftentimes they're both. So Judaism, for example, has similar traditions, and I think that's part of often who you are, is how you're raised and the values and the kind of day-to-day activities that you have. But in this community, I do think that there was a lot more involvement with religion, and because it was such a tight-knit community, so if you didn't go to mosque on Friday, it would be known because it's a small community too. So that might be a factor as well. So another interesting result was that I was ultimately interested in acculturation and acculturated stress, and I wanted to see whether it predicts psychological adjustment in adolescents who identify themselves as Muslim Arab. So what this means essentially is that the more they identified with a heritage culture, and the less experience or less stress they experienced, the better or fewer psychological problems they experienced. So put it in another way, the more I identify myself as Arab, the less stress I experienced, and the less psychological problems like depression, anxiety, marginalization, psychosomatic symptoms that adolescent experienced. It did not occur for those with mainstream culture. So it didn't say that those who identify with mainstream culture, how American I am, mainstream American, they didn't have more problems. It was just that identifying themselves as Arab led to less problems. So there was something there about the heritage protective factor. If I identify myself as Arab, if I identify myself as American, that's great. It didn't seem to make an impact either way, but it was more psychologically healthy to identify themselves as Arab. And then another impact of that was the religiosity. I kind of look at that a little bit more closely. And again, the more they identify themselves as Arab and the more religious they were, they seemed to predict more healthy lifestyle or become more psychologically healthy. So it's interesting because, you know, we often debate, you know, to what degree do you hold on to your heritage culture? Well, for this community and for this group, it seemed to be pretty important. So the other piece, remember I talked about I slipped in the parents? So I was actually asking, I'm like, so, okay, so let's say a kiddo, teenager, 11-year-old, whatever, said, oh, I identify myself as both Arab and American, okay? So then I was like, well, what about a discrepancy between what the adolescent identifies and what the parent identifies? And I was kind of wondering, well, what if the parent was completely opposite, right? So they identify as very Arab, the adolescent is very American. Would that discrepancy predict psychological problems in that adolescent? Similarly, it could be the child is very Arab and the parent is very American, and that discrepancy would predict psychological problems. What I did find is that if there's a discrepancy in the heritage culture, so if the parent identifies as Arab and the child doesn't, or vice versa, that did predict adolescent psychological problems. So it didn't really matter which way it went, as long as there was a difference, it seemed to be problematic. And I might look at this a little bit more because I also asked about conflict between the parent and the child, and I haven't looked at that data at all. It's kind of sitting in my office right now. But I'm also interested, well, is there more conflict between parents parents and adolescents who have a discrepancy between the two? And if there's more conflict, that would help explain why there's more psychological problems, right? So that's kind of my next kind of piece of my project I'm hoping to explore. Because I think this is interesting, because I think if there's parent conflict, that would be something important to look at. So, you know, the big question when we do research is, so what's next, right? So one of the things I always want to look at my research as a very applied, you know, what this means. And for me, you know, the likelihood of me working with an Arab American adolescent is pretty slim in the state of Montana, right? But what I do hope is that it provides one more piece of information for any clinicians, psychologists, people who work with Arab Americans to know a little bit more about how important heritage culture is. I think this long history in the United States to, you know, oh, it should be a melting pot. It should be kind of erasing our heritage culture and becoming more of this mixed heritage, but put together into an umbrella of mainstream America. What I think is losing is that the richness of each of these heritage cultures that fit within this melting pot, and that acknowledging it with these Arab American adolescents is particularly important because it makes, they're happier. These are happier kids, they're healthier kids when they are maintaining their heritage culture. There's a lot more work to go, of course, and in fact in the last 5 years since, you know, I started the study, there's been 5 more articles. So it moved from like 5 articles to 10 articles. So hopefully in the next 20 years it'll just exponentially grow. And I'm hoping to submit this project next week to a journal. So I'm hoping also to contribute to that knowledge. But on a practical level, I think there's a lot we can learn from this. And for you educators or for you working with my ethnic minority youth, some of the same theories apply across a diverse group of ethnic minorities. Certainly with Arab Americans, but there's African American and Latin American literature. I'm less known about Native American acculturation or that experience. But if the theories align, I'm going to presume that there's some of that heritage culture is important to maintain so that they can hold on to that community and to those traditions. So, and I'd like to hear from you, you know, the likelihood of you working with an Arab American might be slim, but, you know, is there a way that you can think about applying some of these ideas of maintaining one's heritage culture to help them? Is there a way you could integrate that into your job, your life? Just out of curiosity. Yeah.
And I work for GUTS, Girls Using Their Strengths here at the YWCA, and an activity that we do with our GUTS girls, it's a family shield. So talking about kind of what does your name mean, and what are some traditions in your family, what's a traditional dress or event or piece of jewelry or something that's been passed down. And it's really fun to learn the girls' backgrounds. And because some girls, there's a lot of girls who are like, I don't know what anything means, and some girls really know what they mean. It's their chance to shine and to let everyone else know.
And I think it's also interesting because I think among white mainstream Americans, we don't often acknowledge our heritage culture to some degree. There's sometimes Irish heritage is sometimes the similar kind of pride, but it's to a different degree than some other ethnic minority groups. And I think to some degree acknowledging our white heritage also recognizes how culture is such an important part, because we often don't recognize our culture. And certainly as white Americans, as me as a white person, we may not recognize what whiteness means, right? But there's something important there, because then we can understand, well, whiteness means a certain thing. There's power, there's privilege associated with that. Let me understand that a little bit better about what it means to be a white woman. So I love that activity. What kinds of responses do the girls have when they're kind of sharing their heritage?
Well, I remember a group in Lowell. There was a girl of Chinese American descent, and she had, I think, 4 different names. And she just took over the whole class, and we encouraged it as facilitators for her to just, it's her time to shine, and she explained each part of her name, and the next group she brought in something. It seemed like she'd never had that opportunity in her school to kind of show her heritage. And so she just talked all about her family traditions, and the girls were asking her questions. And, yeah.
It sounds like she's really proud.
Yeah.
She will share that with her friends.
Right. Yeah, really cool.
Well, I was thinking just like with, what has been going on lately, like in Syria and all these different places, and like in the media, and people maybe like perceiving these places to be like really dangerous and violent places and stuff, and like acknowledging that in schools, and like, like almost like what she was talking about, having like days where teachers can address the kids like, heritages and just really maybe focus on that more, since there's so much, because I could just imagine being an Arab kid and having stuff like this going on and thinking that you're like a bad person, or people saying things to you, and like so just maybe like trying to recognize like all the positive things about their traditions and religions and all of that, and in the schools just integrating it more.
And I think your point is important, because I think the media often reflects what's going on with certainly a lot of Arab countries. But what's also interesting is that you might actually have an Arab American that you've interacted with, but you don't know, because they can be white. They can also be black. They can also be, So I think having opportunities and opening up the door to say, hey, let's, like your activity, let's talk about it. Let's talk about these issues. I think allows them to feel comfortable doing so. Because without the authority figure, the teacher, the facilitator, to say it's okay to talk about it, then they're not going to feel comfortable talking about it,
just
because
like
they're different.
going towards like the acceptance and celebrating of it, rather than just like the tolerating side of it.
Well, it also gives children, they might not know what their ethnicity is, so then it gets them in a dialogue with their parents, and they find out a lot more, and they have communication going with the parents, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's oftentimes, if it's not talked about, they wouldn't know and have that connection.
So when I was in high school, we moved to the Detroit area, and
Which
Dearborn.
Oh, dear, I was going to say, that's
Well,
where
yeah,
I got it.
Yeah. So it was interesting, I guess, kind of coming from very small town white, America, to kind of Detroit area, and then, of course, just being immersed in probably one of the largest populations of Arab Americans. But then, I went to Henry Ford Community College, and of course, a lot of the students were Arab Americans, and there was like this sense of sort of fear, what does this really mean, and kind of going into these communities where, large populations of, Arab Americans were living. But I became friends with a couple of people, and they really opened like their, their homes to me, and but it was interesting because they were like, well, we could never date, just so you know. I mean, it was kind of like one of the very first things, and I was like, okay, I mean, that's fine. But, so it was just kind of like right off the bat, they were like, just so you know, like, that's never gonna happen. I was like, okay. But it was
cultural
really,
expectations, at least. Were put out
exactly,
there.
yeah, but I mean, it was a really great experience, and I think that, kind of setting the fear aside, is kind of, what is, the best thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for those of you who haven't been to Dearborn is it feels like, to me, who I've traveled all over the Arab world, and it feels very Arab. Signs are in Arabic. People walking around in hijabs or burqas, the women, and then there's a lot of, but there's ethnically different. I mean, there's Lebanese, there's Yemenis, there's Jordanians, there's Somalis. So even with Muslim Somalis have lived in that area too. So it's quite diverse racially and ethnically and religiously, and it's pretty amazing. Like, it's a very much an enclave in this community in Detroit. So how long were you there for?
Well, I moved probably in '95. I started going to school there, but then I went to college there for, at Henry Ford for a few years. But I was actually just back in like Dearborn a few years ago, and it was really interesting to kind of see like the huge transformation. I mean, I hadn't really spent time down there in a really long time, so yeah.
Food is amazing.
Oh, I know. I was like,
food there.
yeah, for sure.
Any other thoughts? Perhaps questions?
The Arab population in Montana, what do they do as occupations?
That's a good question. The data wasn't there. It comes from the Arab American Institute. But I'm going to predict, because 85% of Arab Americans are very highly educated, so they have bachelors. I'm going to guess they do everything from being educators to working at university. My colleague, for example, is a professor. And there's actually a couple of language professors, for sure, in universities who teach Arabic. Yeah, besides that, I'm not sure. I'm not positive. I'm going to guess that they live in the hubs, Helena, Missoula. Well, I guess Bozeman, because Gallatin was the biggest one, so, yeah. Awesome. Yeah.
I was curious about the census.
Yeah.
Is there any movement to try to address
There,
that?
for the 2010, there was a little bit of a movement to include Arab Americans in the census, but it was never included. So I'm not sure why or what the politics were of that, but it seemed really easy to include a different bubble. To me,
Right.
change
something
the
that-
form and include, that to me, so I'm not sure why that's so difficult. So Arab Americans in the past, they were called Asian, they were called Pacific Islander Asian, which does not at all capture that community. White, as oftentimes they'll bubble white, or other. So yeah, I'm not sure what that is, and I haven't really found out what the reason or the rationale is for that.
It seems like a really important step to acknowledging Arab culture in our
Absolutely.
society.
Yeah, to some degree, yeah. And, with the current social political climate, there's not a lot of advocacy among non-Arabs, Arab Americans, to really advocate for that community either. And that's what really needs to be done, so that we recognize groups. I mean, with 3 million at a minimum, substantial. They're guessing up to 8 million, so they are actually, it's a huge underestimation. Your comments? Questions? Yeah.
I am curious and want to talk a little bit more about the high religiosity, fewer psychological problems, and then also high religiosity, fewer perceived discrimination. So I'm curious what the teachings of the religion are that might prevent them from perceiving discrimination. So, for example, I'm thinking about do unto others as you would have them do to you. So are there, and here I'm showing my ignorance about their religion, but are they admonished to not go looking for trouble? Are they advised to be generous in how they would view someone, or?
You know, it's interesting, because I don't think it's about the teachings at all.
Really?
Yeah. I actually think it's so partly it's the way I ask the questions about religion. So I was asking questions about the degree of which you participate in religious activities. But there was questions like, how religious are you?
Mm-hmm.
Or how spiritual are you? But a lot of it about the organizational religion, or the organizational religiousness, overall religiosity, spirituality, and practices. So, you know, how often do you read the Quran? How often do you go to the mosque? You know, so on one hand, there is the teaching. So in Islam, there's the 5 pillars, and one of the pillars is certainly charitable work and giving to your own community. But I think it's actually my hypothesis, and when I was writing my manuscript this morning, was that I think it's about that the religion provides a way to develop the ethnic minority community more so, because the religion is the glue, essentially, of the group, of the community. Because even if they're not themselves religious, say, I know a bunch of teenagers who drank, who had sex before marriage, who dated and under, you know, the covers of their parents' eyes. But then they still consider themselves religious, even though they're breaking a bunch or eating hot dogs that have pork in it, right? But to some degree, it's yes, I'm not following some of the principles, but at the same time, I read the Quran with my family every night, or I pray with my father every day, 5 times a day. I attend religious events. I attend community events, and oftentimes community events are religious events. And I think to some degree that's creating this glue that's holding them together to this community. And so, because of this glue, this maintaining, I feel, Arab, I feel some protective factors so that I don't feel like others are discriminating against me. And the way I ask this is the stress associated with perceived discrimination. So it's they might perceive others discriminating against them, but they don't experience the stress related to that. So it's a very particular way of thinking, because I'm looking at a culture of stress. What the next part I would ask is, first of all, I would ask their ethnic identity. So I would ask them how, like, purely their ethnic identity, and then ask them, how many times were you discriminated against, like actual events. But the fact that they're not experiencing stress as a result of it, I think that's what's interesting. And I think it's the teachings partly, but I think it's more so that the religion and the community are so tied together.
It's like a pride protector type
Yeah,
thing.
I think so. I think there's this connection that they have, and I think, which in the way I grew up, even though my family's relatively Christian, I didn't feel like my Christianity background influenced my day-to-day life, the way that maybe Judaism does with Jewish families, or Islam does with Muslim families. That I think the traditions and values of the day-to-day life are integral as part of that, and I think that's a protective factor.
I think there's a lot of confidence and power in knowing really who you are.
I think so. Absolutely.
And then you're supported by that through your religious community.
Yeah, exactly. And there's
And
a
a sense of belonging.
Exactly, and
Mhm.
you're really confident in that, and knowing who you are and trusting who you are.
Absolutely. If you feel isolated, we know that's certainly, especially with adolescents. Remember, this is an adolescent development period. Oh, if you don't have your peer groups, your life is over. It's just, that's a huge part of that. So absolutely. And who in Dearborn, who are you around? Well, you're around other Arab American kids, who speak your language. And if they're not necessarily your ethnic group or their national group, you already have something more in common than you would. Here. Yeah.
I was just gonna mention my partner, he's Jewish, but he, like his family, like he went to Hebrew school when he was younger, and his family will like celebrate traditions and stuff, and like holidays, but he doesn't really like practice, the religion. but it's really interesting to see kind of the two sides of it, like the spirituality side, and then like I'm Jewish and like that's me,
The
and like
culture part.
yeah, exactly. So I mean, I can see like the culture part being like a really big part of it for these Muslim people who are just like, because coming over here is so different, and like really just needing that like sense of like security and wanting to like have your identity and you know, be proud of it. And
Yeah, I like the way you said that, your spirituality and then kind of your traditions and culture.
yeah, because it's interesting like how much he brings up that he's Jewish, and like his brother is living in Israel right now and stuff, but like when it comes to the you know, like everyday things that more prominent Jews, I guess, would be doing, it's not really of interest, but it just comes down to like, this is where my family is from, and like this is what they went through and all of that, so.
And the history of it.
Yeah, and something I couldn't really relate to, so it's pretty cool, yeah.
Yeah, I think that partially explains the Gita, if I answered your question. I think that's my best explanation.
Yeah.
There's no research to even support that. Like really, I'm kind of guessing to some degree. So I don't know.
Yeah, what's next?
Yeah, exactly. My next project is explore, actually, and I do have some ways to explore that. My interest too as a school psychologist is academically. So I actually have some academic outcome data from this data that I collected. So I'd also be curious, well, you know, how's it academically, is it affecting them academically? So that's kind of where I'm also interested in. So, and then the parent and adolescent research project too is I'm submitting that soon in the next month or so. So hopefully there's a couple ways that I'm exploring these issues. But any other questions before we wrap up? I want to make sure you have time to eat. That's important. Well, thank you. And it's been this conversation is always really fun to have, and I think that's what makes why I'm so passionate about this. So thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.